you hear me? So thank you for the invitation, Gilad and thank you for the introduction. Jean Améry and Vladimir Jankélévitch were both Jews who grew up in assimilated families and did not have any special affinity, if at all, with their Jewish origins and heritage. The relationship of both thinkers to their Jewish identity changed dramatically during the Second World War. Both were suddenly and violently put face to face with the fact of their Jewishness and were forced to rethink and reevaluate their self-definition and understanding. But it was not only that they were suddenly reminded, so to speak, that they were Jews. They moreover experienced what it means to be only a Jew and nothing else, what it means to be defined solely by a trait or origin that was completely foreign to them until that historical moment. In my talk, I will closely examine how the two thinkers grapple with the question of their Jewish identity through consideration of two short texts. The first is Améry's The Necessity and Impossibility of Being a Jew, which was recently retranslated under the title On the Impossible Obligation to be a Jew, a text from 1966. And the second, Jankélévitch's Judaism as an Internal Problem from 1960. Both texts deal with the paradoxical nature of Jewish identity and raise crucial questions that concern the unstable yet strangely strong feeling of identity that is never singular and always liminal, a unique combination located on the thin line between self-affirmation and self-doubt. Vladimir Jankélévitch was born in France in 1903 to a family of Jewish Russian intellectuals. Jean Améry was born as Hans Meyer in Austria in 1912 to a Jewish father who died in World War I and a Christian mother. Both grew up in assimilated homes and, as they later testify, had no special relation to their Jewish origins. The two studied parallel, of course, not together, philosophy and literature, and were interested in German thought and culture. They experienced the time of the war, the German occupation in Europe, firsthand. Améry, in the beginning in the annexed Austria, and later on, as is famously known through his writings, both in the Brandon prison where he was tortured, and also in Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and other concentration camps. And Jankélévitch was fired from the university in France on the account of his Jewishness. Both were active in the resistance, Jankélévitch in France and Améry in Belgium, and both combined between a uniquely personal, autobiographic point of view and a discussion of philosophical, universal, ethical questions. Finally, Améry and Jankélévitch both turned their backs on German culture and legacy right after the war. Améry famously changed his name from Meyer to Améry, but did, this is worthwhile mentioning, continue to write in German. And Jankélévitch completely stopped speaking German after the war, neglected his previous preoccupation with German culture, and even removed German references from his previously published works. He also never listened to German music again. Despite the obvious similarities in these two life courses, not a lot has been written about the possible relationship between their ideas. Or, to be more accurate, there exists a body of secondary literature that brings the two thinkers together. However, to my knowledge, it is always in the context of their argument regarding the problem of forgiveness and resentment. Specifically, Améry's essay, Resentment, and Jankélévitch's book, Forgiveness, as well as his famous Should We Pardon Them? These texts are indeed fascinating, and the problem of forgiveness is immensely important, especially in the literature dealing with the aftermath of the Holocaust. However, focusing only on this problem and the interrelationship between them is very limited, or limits our view of this relationship. And this is something that I'd like to challenge today, or to give an alternative. In the last few years, I've been working on Améry in an attempt to offer a novel view of his work, such that is not based on and entangled with his experiences during the war, or what is usually thought of in the field of Holocaust studies, where he is admired. I'm looking at a variety of his texts, not concentrating only on his famous and well-interpreted Beyond Guilt and Atonement, which was translated as At the Mind's Limits into English, but also on his books on old age and on suicide, and different other short essays on philosophical figures and questions, such as Kant and the Enlightenment, Adorno, Heidegger, freedom, Nietzsche, and others. Although I do not want to concentrate on his survivor essays, so to speak, I also find it important not to leave them aside completely. They do belong to a coherent whole that I'm trying to identify in Améry. And this is not an easy task, especially since Améry himself writes about his personal experiences in the war in a very explicit and autobiographical manner. So my way into this disentanglement of the difficulty includes several different attempts to discuss some of the themes that arise in Améry's work as such, and are not limited to him being a survivor or to the writings that deal explicitly with the Holocaust. So to go back to the example of resentment and forgiveness that I mentioned earlier, and I'm not going to talk about today, when I'm approaching, for instance, this text in Améry, I'm not reading it as one that poses a question that has to do solely with the feeling that Améry, the survivor, harbors towards the Nazis, but rather view it as a problem, the problem of resentment versus forgiveness, view it as a problem that is situated on the juncture between emotion and temporality, and the problem of historical consciousness, and to add another element, perhaps Améry's complex relationship to figures such as Heidegger, for instance. So I would like to address the question of Jewish identity today in my talk along similar lines. That is, although Améry is, of course, of his own, aware of his own Jewishness, and this is the explicit topic of the text that I'm going to deal with, I would nevertheless like to think of it in a broader discussion of the question of identity, question of self-understanding, and the inherent paradoxality and even alienation that always remains essential to how we view or can view ourselves. I'm also widening my perspective today to include Jankélévitch, whom I take to be one of the more interesting philosophers of the period, whose work also fell prey to a somewhat partial and biased reading that is overly guided by him being a Jew and a victim of the Second World War. So I will begin with Améry and then move to Jankélévitch and end with some closing remarks on the relationship between the two. So Jean-Améry has a distinctive Jewish origin, as I said. So his Jewishness is a given fact for him, a piece of knowledge, a designation, a label. But this fact remains external to him, as he describes it, a mere label towards which he feels no special intimacy. As he writes elsewhere, when he describes his childhood, he was a Jew akin to the way one of his friends or schoolmates was a son of a bankrupt innkeeper. That is, his Jewishness was, again, simply a fact, without it being turned into a significant element of his identity. It was not debatable, but also something that was not internally or authentically felt in any way. It was not his own. There was, however, a precise moment when this assimilated generic European identity that he held was shaken to the bone. And this was a historical moment of the war, what he describes in the essay, The Necessity and Impossibility of Being a Jew. It was in 1935, when Améry, then still Maya, was sitting in a bourgeois cafe in Vienna, drinking his coffee and reading the newspaper. There, he saw an article about the newly enacted Nuremberg laws. It then became clear to him, and I'm rephrasing his own description, immediately and beyond any doubt, that these laws applied to him. His identity remained just as it had been an hour earlier. He did not magically, in his words, become more Mediterranean or Semitic looking. And his frame of reference was not filled with Hebrew allusions. And yet, he would never be the same as he was. Society, concretized in the National Socialistic German state, had just made me, he writes, and I quote, formally and beyond any question, a Jew, end quote. It had given him what he calls a new dimension to what he was until that, point, only a known fact. So this fact is now starting to be felt, and its implications are being felt as well, of course. When we think of the term identity, of course, this philosophical term has a very long history, which I'm not going to go into in this context of the talk. But when we think about it as a philosophical term, but also on the more intuitive level, we usually think of something that defines and determines us, characterizes us, like nothing else can. Something that is, well, identical to what we perceive ourselves to be. In other words, our identity is part of our self-definition and understanding. So I want to continue here following this intuitive definition with a quote from Améry. This is a quote that appears at the beginning of the text that I'm talking about his Jewish identity. So I quote, "If today discomfort arises in me when a Jew takes it for granted and legitimately that I am part of his community, then it is not because I don't want to be a Jew, but only because I cannot be one. And yet, I must be one. Nur weil ich es nicht sein kann und es doch sein muss. And I do not merely submit to this necessity, but expressly claim it as part of my person. The necessity and impossibility of being a Jew. That is what causes me indistinct pain. It is with this necessity, with this impossibility, this oppression, this inability that I must deal with here." End quote. So when Améry writes that he cannot be a Jew, but also must be one, he's alluding to the question of obligation, which was given expression in the New Translation, as I said, of the text, in the title of the New Translation. Namely, he's obliged to be a Jew by way of the Nuremberg laws of the German political world and a set of other external measures. His identity, in other words, is forced on him, and he is obliged to obey. At stake is nothing less than his life. What being a Jew means to Améry is, and I quote again, to be a dead man on leave. Or another quote, to be firmly promised to death, already in the midst of life. Although there is a certain rebellious tone in this essay, as we find, I have to say, almost in all of his texts, he's nevertheless not exactly resistant to his Jewishness. In fact, he claims to take it upon himself, to wear it on his sleeve, so to speak. This includes a fatal refusal, which is an interesting biographical anecdote, a fatal refusal on his part to a suggestion of his mother's ex-fiancé, who agreed to declare that Améry was his son rather than the son of his Jewish father, something that would have granted him a German identification card, but he refused this attempt. So he's forced into a situation of being Jewish from the outside, but accepts it in pride. This coalescence between the two colliding elements, the necessity and the impossibility, constitutes Améry's identity as a split one. Instead of being one with himself, he is violently divided. He is identical yet foreign to himself. I quote, "I feel like a stranger, fremd," he writes. "I just have to adapt to this externality, Fremdheit. I have to accept the estrangement, Fremdsein," that's in the same sentence, "as an element of my personality. I have to insist on it." This constitution is described in the text on the background of the alienation that he feels from the surrounding world. He says that he has to accept that he is foreign, that he will always be foreign, that he will always find himself alone. The sense of loneliness that reappears numerous times in the essay that I'm talking about, but also in the whole book, The Mind's Limits, is finally Améry's Jewish identity. That is the only, this foreignness and Jewish identity, this combination is the only existential space, so to speak, that can provide him some kind of refugee. And there is another very interesting essay in the same collection about his homelessness, his feeling of homelessness. He writes that he cannot rely on people around him, but only on his Jewish identity. So there is a strange twist there. He calls it my burden and my support. It's interesting to see how this internal split, convulsion perhaps, is expressed in Améry's rhetorical gestures, in his prose. To take one example, which I find interesting, the essay opens with this uneasiness that Améry feels when people draw him into some kind of a plural speech and include him when they use the expression "we Jews." This is the quote that I read out earlier. But further on in the text, especially in the second half, he begins to move somewhat freely between the singular and the plural. He writes, for instance, about the loss of his own dignity, which is a recurring and very interesting theme in the text. And then, a line or two later, he moves to expressions like, I quote, "the deprivation of dignity that we had experienced." And the list of such examples is very, very long. So there is a constant movement in the text that deals with identity between the I and the we. I'll stop the Améry part a bit abruptly perhaps here, and I'm going to move to Jankélévitch, and then I'll close with a glance back at Améry. So I'd now like to move to the essay Judaism as an Internal Problem, which is a text that Jankélévitch wrote as a lecture in 1960. In a phrasing that is very similar to that of Améry, Jankélévitch too writes that Judaism is of an essential internal split or internal divide. It is his indisputable reality, but one from which we, this is how he writes it, feel completely estranged. It is a fact, but we nevertheless want to deny it. However, he adds, we feel a strong, and I quote, internal protest that disavows any urge towards such denial. He develops this argument as what he calls an internal problem, or an internal split. But this definition is not limited in this text to the case of Jewish identity, which is the explicit topic, but rather Jankélévitch extends the discussion to a much wider argument about the structure of identity as such. To be oneself, he writes, is necessarily coupled with a sense of a very tangible form of alterity. I'd like to quote a sentence about that from the essay. Obviously, he writes, every man is other than himself, and is only a man by virtue of this possibility that he has of being outside the self and beyond the self, of not being graspable by definition, and of always overflowing his current state. End quote. So for Jankélévitch, to be a man, to be human, is to be in a constant, incessant movement away from oneself. In other words, his understanding of identity here moves from the intuition that I mentioned earlier, that our self is identical, overlapping, to our self-understanding, to our identity. But here, as the quote suggests, for Jankélévitch, to be oneself actually means to stand outside and beyond oneself, to overflow, to cross our own borders. This locates identity closer to movement and transformation than it is to the determinant quality of a single stable definition. But Jankélévitch takes this even further when he continues to discuss the relationship between identity and alterity of the Jew. I quote again, "But the Jew is 2 times absent from himself. And by virtue of this, we could say that he is a man par excellence. He is a man twice over. By virtue of this inability to be absent from himself and to be something other than himself, he is twice as human." So this appears in 3 different phrasings, the same claim appears 3 times. Man is only man because he ceaselessly becomes what he is, and consequently, he is always another. But in the fact of being Jewish, there is a supplementary exponent of alterity that resides in his escaping every definition. I think we can hear here subtext of ideas that Jean-Paul Sartre has about identity, and this is an influence on both Jankélévitch and Améry, an explicit influence. Being a Jew duplicates and thereby deepens alterity, and in that sense makes the Jew, or turns the Jew into a man par excellence. He's not only outside and beyond himself, but also always another, and other. In a strange way, Jankélévitch understands Jewish identity as one that is not only unstable and subversive, but also one that makes him human. Jankélévitch alludes to Jean Val here. According to Val, a tension exists between two contradictory elements. The first is an indeterminacy that appears as something more, with a hyphen between the something and the more. And the second element, an indiscernible evidence that does not have legal existence, but that nonetheless is an integral part of our being and of our nature. For Jankélévitch, these are two, and I'm quoting now, 2 incomplete truths that send us indefinitely back and forth from one to the other. And this is a structure that I find very important, and I'll go back to at the end of the talk. I continue with the quote: "The fact that we are Jews implies some distinct attributes, but the fact that we are something other than that matters more still." And for him, what is important here is precisely to retain this duplicity, to adopt it, and to understand it as being completely essential. The Jews, he claims, embody this principle of something else, of a constant being something else. And this is for him, or this embodies for him, for Jankélévitch, a principle of opening, of movement, of transformation. This is precisely why, for Jankélévitch, Jewish identity is infinitely definable and therefore indefinable. So he brings these two together in an interesting gesture. For any gesture of definition implies finitude and arrest. To this he writes that the serenity that lies in our being identical to ourselves, one with ourselves, can only give us reassurance when we stay on the surface of the question of identity, so to speak. If we go deeper, this serenity becomes impossible. Améry knew Jankélévitch's work and names him as one of the few people from whom he has learned much. This is his wording. He mentions him once in his book on aging in the context of his discussion of death. And what is interesting to our context here is that this single place in which Améry is referring to Jankélévitch is a place where he speaks about impossibility. And he speaks there about death and the impossibilities inherent to this concept. So he quotes Jankélévitch's idea that death is a thinking of the unthinkable. This is taken from Jankélévitch's book with the title Death. Despite the obvious differences between death and identity, this is no doubt a version of the structure of the necessity and impossibility. It is not my claim here that Améry was directly influenced from Jankélévitch's essay on Jewish identity when he's discussing death. However, I do think that it is interesting that the very thing that attracted the former to the latter was precisely the discussion of what is necessary, namely the fact that we are going to die, and at the same time impossible for us to grasp, or for language to grasp. Améry is interested in the structure of this essential paradox, which he takes to be inherent to his own Jewishness, and I dare to say to identity when thought of at large. We are never entirely identical with ourselves. And as Jankélévitch taught us in his text, it is precisely Jewish identity that does not allow this overflowing or excessive identity that is so crucial in turning us into dynamic, developing human beings. It is perhaps this fact that renders specifically Jewish identity to be so disquieting for both thinkers. And perhaps surprisingly, it is because when externally forced on us, it becomes no identity at all, or rather no longer conforms to the definition of what identity is in both, namely overflowing indeterminate emotion. In this context, the claim that both share about anti-Semitism becomes all the more interesting. The anti-Semite's definition of the Jew, and I'm now referring only to the two texts that I'm talking about today, is as stable and restricted as can be. It marks a clear border between the us and the them. Or, as Jankélévitch puts it, it closes the Jew off in his Jewish confines. The Jew can now merely be a Jew, or be merely a Jew, not allowing any other trait of identity to take part of this definition. And if we take Jankélévitch's understanding of identity seriously and combine it with Améry's structure of the necessity and the impossibility, we could say that by narrowing the definition of Jewishness as the anti-Semite does, the anti-Semite dispossesses the Jew from anything that we understand, or we learn to understand today, to be an identity in the first place. So, in that sense, anti-Semitism has turned both Améry and Jankélévitch into Jews, but at the same time denied them the possibility to be them, or to be themselves. Jankélévitch's words again, I quote, "What the anti-Semites deny us is to be other than ourselves." And in Améry's strong phrasing, which he used in a different text this time, in a conversation he had with Ingo Hermann, where he said, I quote, "From Hitler on, I am Jewish. Hitler invented me as a Jew." Reaching the end. So when I began the talk, I put the theme in a broader context of what I'm trying to do in my own larger project on Améry's work, namely to release the discussion from the grip of the Jewish or the post-Holocaust or the trauma studies context. But in effect, I did end up here with a rather strong claim about the role that anti-Semitism plays in both texts. So it appears that the temptation to go in this direction took hold of me too. I would, however, like to end by linking these ideas of Améry and Jankélévitch about Jewish identity to a structure that is dominant, I think, in both thinkers' works. And I'm speaking now, I'm now zooming out. And not only when they speak about questions of Judaism and identity. And this is there is a recurring attempt in both of them to express their arguments, to position their arguments as being always on the verge between two options, never stable, never strictly defined or located. And of course, time is short and I cannot give all the examples, but just to give a taste of it, so we can take, for instance, Jankélévitch's beautiful book on music, Music and the Ineffable, where he speaks, and the way that he speaks about music as a sort of an asymptotic movement towards an intimation of that which can never be really or fully and explicitly uttered. And of course, his constant movement and change in positions regarding the question of forgiveness. And in Améry, this is apparent really everywhere. But let me just give an example of two subtitles of his book, two of his books. So the first, Beyond Guilt and Atonement, was subtitled, which was not translated into English, is something like Attempt of Overcoming by the One Who Was Overcome, or in the original, Bewältigungsversuche eines Überwältigten, as well as his book on aging that has the interesting subtitle Revolt and Resignation. So this is of course not accidental. For both thinkers there is this in-betweenness that becomes a philosophical principle, a position of an aporia. And when both speak, for instance, not without criticism about Israel as a Jewish state, they both speak about this aporetic principle. And for instance, Jankélévitch speaks there about the fact that the Hegelian synthesis, as he writes, has no attraction for us. And this is why the perplexity between the two options that he's speaking about, I quote now, will last until the end of time, which has no end. So, final paragraph, to follow up on the discussion we had yesterday, it is precisely the crisis that does not lead to a decision, but leaves us fluctuating between the different options and positions we can take. The interesting question that I hope I added to this discussion today is that of identity. And it seems to me that both thinkers suggest that we think differently about what it means to be a self, and to be human, to have an identity that is defined in both of them as overflowing and when it is in a constant motion. So this is not deferral, as Vivian presented yesterday, but rather, I would say, a development, a transformation, and perhaps an acceptance that who and what we are can never be stable. And I actually don't see this as a crisis. This was another question that was raised yesterday. What does it mean to be in a constant state of crisis? So I don't see this movement itself as a crisis, but rather as a really very deep understanding of the human condition. And perhaps it is an understanding, and here a crisis does come in, that can be revealed to us only when we are facing crisis. Thank you.
All right, thank you.